is our job. Our hearts are hurting this evening. Those individuals who have lost loved ones or do not know where their loved ones are in our prayers and are in our thoughts. Thank you all very much.
Well, there we are, a briefing from the White House in Washington, confirming what we've seen happening in New York and Washington today, the Pentagon under attack, 2 attacks in New York against the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, detailing all the medical teams that will be going to assist those who've been injured in these attacks, and also the increased security, which was inevitably going to follow. It'll no longer be as easy as hopping on a bus to hop on an American domestic flight. Now, there are reports of explosions near the Afghan capital, Kabul. Reports say plumes of smoke can be seen coming from the direction of the airport to the north, and fires are burning. A Pentagon official has told the Reuters news agency the explosions are not the product of a U.S. strike. And in fact, we heard it ourselves from the U.S. Defense Secretary, who denied any American involvement in what's going on in Kabul tonight. Let's join our correspondent Kate Clark, who's across the border from Afghanistan in Islamabad. Kate, I know you're keeping close touch with what's happening in Kabul on the phone and so on. Can you first of all tell us about this attack tonight on the city?
Yes, there were 7 or 8 explosions overnight. People could see the lights in the sky from the explosions. And there were early reports, people were worried that this was the start of an American attack. I spoke to people in Kabul, Afghans, and they said, no, it looks like it's part of the long-running Afghan civil war, that these were incoming rockets from the anti-Taliban forces. They said they were followed by anti-aircraft fire and the sound of Taliban jet fighters taking off.
Now, what can you tell us about Osama bin Laden, who's a guest, isn't he, of the Taliban government in Afghanistan? What can you tell us about where he might be and the resources he has at his disposal, and what he's been saying in recent days about the United States?
Well, Osama bin Laden is not in Kabul. There have never been any sightings of him there. He's more likely to be in the southern city of Kandahar, which is the Taliban headquarters, or in the east of the country. And that's why it would have been very strange that even if America had drawn very hasty conclusions over who was behind the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and they thought it was Osama bin Laden or the Taliban, that they would have retaliated by bombing Kabul. But of course, everyone's a bit jittery in Afghanistan, because 3 years ago, after 2 embassies were bombed, 2 American embassies were bombed in Africa, the Americans did retaliate by launching cruise missile attacks against sites where they believed that Osama bin Laden might be. So he's still in Afghanistan, he's still under the protection of the Taliban, and that's why people were worried.
Now, as far as we know, he said nothing today about these attacks, but the Taliban have denied he was involved. Is that right?
That's right. They called emergency press conferences in Kabul and in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, and they wanted to get this message over that he was not involved, they were not involved. What they said, they just had a 2-sentence statement. Afghanistan feels the pain of the American people, and we hope the terrorists are caught and brought to justice and to trial. In questioning, they said that Osama bin Laden could not have been involved because he doesn't have a telephone or contact with the outside world. Now, that is something that the Americans and others may at some point have questions about, because they've always said that this line from the Taliban is not true, that he does have contact with his supporters elsewhere. But the other thing that the Taliban said was that they hoped that America would launch a full investigation, give its evidence to the world before it made any move. So this was clearly an attempt by the Taliban to try and distance themselves, to try and make sure that if America is angry and looking for someone to blame, that the Taliban and Afghanistan are distant from that.
Kate Clark, thanks very much. And just to gauge other reaction around the Middle East, it's been varied. Earlier in the day, we saw some Palestinians dancing and celebrating in the streets when they heard news of the attacks in New York and Washington. But most governments in the Middle East have condemned the attacks. Let's go to Tehran now. I think we can join our correspondent there, Jim Muir. Jim, what are they saying in Tehran about these devastating attacks in Washington and New York?
There's been some very strong condemnation here from President Khatami himself. He described it as a terrorist act which should be very strongly condemned. He expressed great regret and huge sympathy with the American people, especially those who'd been directly touched or bereaved by the tragedies. He went further than that. He said that terrorism should be rooted out by international society, and that Iran itself would spare no effort in that direction. So this is really quite strong words from the Iranian president. Whether he's talking for all parts of this rather divided regime here, especially the hardliners — he of course is a reformist — remains to be seen. Hardliners still regard America as the great enemy. They still call it the great Satan. It's regularly denounced at Friday prayers and so on. And in the streets here also, first reaction, of course it's early hours of the morning now, but when the news first came out, first reaction from some young people was very mixed. Some were full of sympathy and horror. Others were a lot less sympathetic. They condemn America for supporting Israel against the Palestinians and believe that the Americans have been given a taste of their own medicine.
And in the past, of course, the Americans have regarded Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, haven't they?
Indeed, that's very much an image that the Iranians are trying to shake off, and I think that that's part of the text behind President Khatami's reaction. The Iranians essentially have taken the line for quite a long time now that all terrorism is to be condemned, and of course they actually berate the Western countries for some of whom have given sanctuary to the People's Mujahideen, which is an Iranian opposition group based abroad and which has carried out some very devastating attacks in the past here in Iran itself, killing civilians and top leaders and so on. So that is the official position, and they've routinely denied very angrily American suggestions of involvement in terrorism, although in the early years there certainly was quite a lot of evidence of Iranian involvement in, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was involved in kidnapping and so on. So it's a past which Iran is very definitely trying to move on from.
As we try to make sense of it and who might be behind it, obviously we've just heard from Washington that they're not pointing the finger officially at anyone, although there are various reports quoting unnamed official that Osama bin Laden could well be involved. Are they pointing any fingers of blame in Tehran?
No, but I sense that they certainly wouldn't be very upset if Osama bin Laden and his Taliban hosts were to be held accountable, because the relations between Iran and the Taliban in Afghanistan, neighbors of course, are extremely tense, very hostile. Afghanistan or the Taliban are Sunni Muslims, the Iranians are largely Shia Muslims. That's part of the split, but basically they're historically daggers drawn, so they certainly wouldn't be averse to seeing the Taliban being punished, although of course they would have mixed feelings, because it is right on their borders, and just as Iraq was an enemy punished by the Americans, they're not comfortable about American intervention right on their borders, but they're certainly no friends of the Taliban.
Jim Muir in Tehran, thanks very much. It may be at least 24 hours before there's any accurate estimate of how many have died in the attack, but the mayor of New York said tonight the death toll would be more than any of us could bear. He also appealed for blood donations for the injured, who've been taken to 170 hospitals across New York.
Rescue workers overwhelmed by their task. For New York, this was a nightmare come true. The scale of the carnage remains unclear, but it's possible that many thousands of people may have been killed. It's still too dangerous for the authorities to search the rubble that was the World Trade Center. The National Guard has been sent in to relieve exhausted firemen. The hospitals are overwhelmed.
All right, well then let's go north then.
For a while, the city's mayor Giuliani was himself trapped in the emergency control center, which was close to the towers. Later, he said the city's hospitals had been coping with more than 2,000 injured, but it's clear there's much more bad news to come.
Good afternoon. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear ultimately. And I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible.
As survivors walked around dazed, no one could be sure how many did not escape before the towers collapsed. Some estimate as many as 20,000 could still have been inside. Across America tonight, families will be coming to terms with untold grief. Within a couple of hours of the attack, volunteers were queuing to give blood at this Red Cross centre after the city's hospitals reported a critical shortage. Red Cross shelters are also being set up, offering support to the injured and bereaved. In Washington, rescue workers tended to hundreds of defense staff. After the Boeing 757 had crashed into the Pentagon, there was an orderly evacuation from the rest of the building. But nearly 5 hours later, the flames were still too intense to allow rescue in some affected areas. Again, the death toll is uncertain.
I don't have any sense of scale at all. We know there are casualties. I can't give you a good number, and we're going to work to try to get that as quickly as I can, but we don't have it yet.
America is in shock. As well as the casualties on the ground, 266 died on board the 4 aircraft. But everyone knows that that is just the start. The full horror of what's been done to this resilient nation will take time to sink in. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
You're watching BBC World News on the day of devastating attacks on New York and Washington. Across America, citizens are trying to come to grips with the enormity of it all. Our correspondent Tom Carver reports it'll be days before the country returns to anything resembling normal life.
The American Airlines plane slammed into the ground floor of the Pentagon. It was less than an hour after the World Trade Center attack. All 6 stories of the building on one side were destroyed, leaving a massive hole in the military headquarters of the world's superpower. Stunned 3-star generals and clerks were herded into surrounding car parks, which were turned into emergency medical centers. The Air Force was activated to shoot down any other plane which came close. This is the first attack on the Pentagon in American history.
You could tell it was like a suicide bomber. But I'm not saying there was a bomb, but, you know, it was a plane. And it just came, it came streaking down and it hit short. It didn't go into the top of the Pentagon. It came like in short, and then everything sprayed up, like a fireball sprayed up on the wall.
A quarter of an hour later, a 757 crashed into a field close to Camp David, the president's rural retreat. The president himself was hundreds of miles away in Florida, about to talk to some school children, when his chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispered the news to him. Minutes later, he was boarding Air Force One. Instead of returning to Washington, he went to an Air Force base in Louisiana.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people.
Washington itself has been virtually sealed off from the outside world. Every federal office has been closed, thousands of workers sent home. Even Congress has been evacuated and shut.
It's another Pearl Harbor for this country. And I gathered my staff and we calmly held a prayer meeting, and then I told them to go home.
Across the country, banks and schools have been ordered to close. Inner cities are deserted. Many parts of the country have declared states of emergency. There is no air traffic over America at present. All planes have been ordered to land at the nearest airport. A nationwide appeal for blood has gone out. In several cities, the phone networks have been frozen. Here on the eastern seaboard, the motorways are clogged with traffic. If it was the terrorists' intention to sow confusion and panic in America, at least on this day, it would seem they succeeded. Tom Carver, BBC News, Washington.
Now, news is emerging of what it was like on one of the planes before it crashed into the World Trade Center. The American network ABC reports tonight that a flight attendant on board the first plane managed to give American Airlines operation on the ground the seat number of the person involved in the hijacking. And by the time that the second plane crashed into the Trade Center, ground control knew what was going on, but they had a helpless feeling. All they could do was watch. And ABC reported that hijackers on board carried knives and box knives, and that some people on board were injured before the planes crashed. And ABC said that some passengers managed to convey this information via mobile phones before the planes crashed into the World Trade Center. Worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift, and so too have been the denials of guilt. Those responsible will have had money and resources available to only a few terrorist organizations, and the focus of the investigation into America's worst breach of security will inevitably fall on Islamic and extremist groups. As George Ekin reports, it'll be those responsible for previous attacks on United States interests around the world who'll come under closest scrutiny.
To some, the horror and carnage inflicted on the United States today is a cause of celebration. This was the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, where many showed their approval of a day of unprecedented terror in America's backyard. A claim of responsibility was reported from one Palestinian group, but then swiftly denied. The Palestinian leader condemned the attacks.
We are completely shocked, Unbelievable.
Investigators hunting the organizers will first consider these were airborne suicide missions on a scale not seen since the Second World War.
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
And it's this wealthy Arab fundamentalist that American officials are already naming as an immediate suspect, Osama bin Laden. He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants, and he's vowed to destroy the United States. Bin Laden is accused of masterminding a string of attacks, including the US embassy bombings in East Africa 3 years ago, which killed more than 200 people. In retaliation, the Americans fired cruise missiles at training camps used by bin Laden in Afghanistan. They put a $5 million price on his head and led a worldwide crackdown on Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan's ruling Taliban, which continues to offer bin Laden sanctuary, insists he isn't capable of carrying out attacks like today's. But bin Laden is suspected of involvement in the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died when a bomb exploded in an underground car park. His associate, Ramzi Youssef, was jailed for that and for plotting to blow up a dozen American airliners over the Pacific, a plan which in some respects foreshadowed today's terror. While the possibility isn't being excluded, no one's suggesting that the devastation of such high-profile international targets like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is domestic terrorism. The sophistication of today's attacks with highly trained perpetrators and their synchronization to occur within 2 hours point towards months, if not years, of preparation. Does all this mean, then, that a rogue state might be involved? Some experts are skeptical.
Countries have realized that as governments, their involvement in terrorism has cost them more than it's gained them. And so there are very few countries left who are in the real terrorism business. Obviously, some governments fund groups that may conduct terrorist acts, but that's very different than actually providing government support for it.
State condolences flood in, yet it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the biggest and bloodiest terrorist operation ever could have been planned and prepared without a single government around the world even noticing. George Ekin, BBC News.
Well, it's 10 to 1 in the morning now here in London, and the first edition of the London newspapers are now out on the streets. Let's have a glance through them, see how they're assessing the devastating attacks in the United States. There's the front page of The Independent. Very short on words, very heavy on dramatic picture. Just simply says Doomsday America with the explosions as the planes crash into the World Trade Center. Another plane here, the Financial Times, another paper rather, the Financial Times, showing the smoke rising out of Manhattan, the Statue of Liberty here in the bottom. Assault on America, the paper says, U.S. forces on high alert, Bush vows revenge, air travel chaos, world markets paralyzed. The Daily Mail, just a simple picture again, which tells the horror of it all. Apocalypse, New York, September the 11th, 2001. And inside, 30 pages of pictures and special reports. The Guardian newspaper, a declaration of war, they call it. And the Times newspaper, once again, similar pictures when war came to America. Look at some of the papers out in London early this morning. The American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has given his first statement about the attacks from the Pentagon, where, of course, one of the planes crashed. He saw that, and this is what he had to say.
We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army, Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this, as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is it's not possible to have solid casualty figures at this time. And the various components are doing roster checks, and we'll have information at some point in the future, and as quickly as it's possible to have it, it will certainly be made available to each of you. I'll be happy to take a few questions after asking First General Shelton if he would like to say anything, and then we will allow the others to make a remark or two.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people, acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history. And yet I think it can be its finest hour as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act, a series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Senator John Warner speaking there from the Pentagon about today's attacks. Establishing the precise death toll of today's attacks could take days, perhaps even weeks. We do know, though, that aboard the 4 airliners alone, there were 266 people on board, and there were no known survivors. And tonight, the Firefighters Union are saying that 200, perhaps 250 firefighters died in the attacks at the World Trade Center. And a police source was also said 78 officers are missing. One of our correspondents, Stephen Evans, was in the second tower when the plane hit. This is what he saw.
It's more what I felt, really. I was at the base of the second tower, if you like, the second tower that was hit on a busy, obviously a busy morning. If you wanted to choose timing, that would be the time to do it, 9:15, in a complex of buildings where 50,000 people work. There was an explosion. I didn't think it was an explosion, but the base of the building shook. I felt it shake. I thought, well, that can't be right. It felt like a big weight, a construction weight, falling from a great, great height. People moved out very, very calmly, no screaming or anything like that, but you could see moisture on their eyes and you could hear fear you could hear the fear in their voices. And then when we were outside, the second explosion happened, and there were then a series of explosions. You can see these pictures. The thing that strikes me about these pictures is that some of those emergency vehicles were clearly there when later debris rained on them. So one of the things that happened was basically the structure, the engineering, if you like, of the structure wasn't apparent to the security forces. We are now, 8 hours after that. The operation goes on. We can only wonder at the kind of damage, the kind of human damage which was caused by those explosions, those series of explosions.
How long after the attacks by the planes did the buildings actually collapse? And what happened in that intervening period?
The buildings eventually collapsed, but they collapsed about 2 hours later. There was an explosion when the aircraft hit one of the towers, and then another explosion about, 10 minutes later when a second aircraft hit the second tower. But the building then collapsed about 2 hours later. What we're now getting is this city is now eerie. The avenue behind me in Midtown has been closed off. People are shocked. I know it's a kind of a cliche that people say this about these kind of things, if you can imagine this kind of thing. But people are literally stunned, speechless by this whole thing. People are digesting it. There may well be some kind of appetite for revenge. The television programs are using captions like "America under attack." That word, Pearl Harbor, keeps cropping up. The president's statement says, "The resolve of our great nation is being tested. Make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test." The mood is, as I say, stunned into silence. There are some angry people about. There was a bit of what we British call the Dunkirk spirit. People literally out in the street calling for the public to give blood. It's a very mixed emotion.
To recap, there's been a series of catastrophic attacks on the heart of American power in New York and Washington. 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown directly into the twin towers of the World Trade Center, and to the Pentagon in Washington. Senator John Warner has just described it as America's most tragic hour, but it could be their finest hour. You're watching BBC World News. Stay with us for continuous coverage of the American attacks.